Arun is a hard act to follow, but I have a feeling our next presenter is up to the challenge. She's Joanne Nova. She's the author of The Skeptic's Handbook and prize-winning graduate of molecular biology. She's hosted a children's television series on science, done more than 200 radio interviews, performed for more than 50,000 students, and is a professional speaker delivering science-based keynote addresses at various conferences. As an associate lecturer at the Australian National University, she has helped to develop the graduate diploma in science communication. Nova published the book Serious Science Party Tricks, and once managed a circus called the Shell Questacon Science Circus, performing science across Australia. She attended the ICCC meetings in Bali in 2007, and she is a tireless online warrior, the founder and proprietor of one of the most read climate science blogs in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Joanne Nova.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here and honour knowing some of you have come so far. I normally would talk about the science, the evidence, what we know, what we don't know about, those kind of things, but everybody else has done that before me, and in esteemed company like Bob Carter here and Ian Plimer today. Why would I do that? So I'm going to try and move the debate a little bit forward, tread on that dangerous ground of how we understand where the debate is coming from, and it's not about the science. I want to talk about the evidence, but we're stopped from talking about the evidence lots of different ways, among them name-calling and bullying, which keep people quiet. So I want to talk about these kind of things. And just to be clear right from the outset that I understand what ad hominems and argument from authority is, nothing that I say about anybody's intentions or motivations or the reasons why people are persuaded to do what they do has anything to do with science, and I know it. So bear in mind, when I talk about the science, I've judged it based on the evidence, the papers that I've seen, and not on any discussions on why people are doing what they're doing. But it helps us who want to get out the message about the evidence. It helps us to understand what drives some of the people, as much as we can tell, which is not much, but we can guess, and how we can change the debate. Because clearly standing there talking about the science works, but not as well as talking about the politics, about using shame or satire or parody, or any of the other mechanisms we have to get the message out. But we want people to pay attention to the evidence. And, I mean, you've already seen today, I'm pretty sure people would have covered the fact that the so-called pollutant turned out to be aerial fertiliser, that the ice core correlation turns out to run backwards, and we know temperatures drive carbon, and whether carbon has any effect forwards is yet to be formally attributed. The Arctic sea ice might be shrinking, but global sea ice has barely changed in the last 30 years. And we know that glaciers and sea levels are rising, but they started rising 100 years before human emissions really took off. And we also know that as money poured into the climate science debate, mysteriously 75% of all the stations were dropped from the statistics. And we're told the warming is unprecedented, but we're not told that there are hundreds of studies that show that it was warmer 1,000 years ago. So why the gaping hole in our media coverage? Why aren't we hearing the other side of the story as well? Well, 2,000 years after Aristotle, Western civilization still hasn't learned to reason. Our latest advance is just to package the errors 2 for 1. There is argument from authority and argument from ignorance, and you can quote the ICCC and do both at once. They say we're deniers who do not accept the scientific consensus. I say, hell no we don't. We stand by Galileo, Aristotle and Einstein. We demand evidence and not just opinions. This calling to consensus is the stuff of tribal witch doctors. Chief Kevin and the Council of Crows say the storms are coming. The gods are angry, we must pay them in barnacles, carbon credit ones, to ward off the wind. This is just an age-old fight that's been going on since the dawn of human time. In fact, if you said that this is a game that's been running for 20 or 30 years, I would say this has been running since the dawn of fungus. Because this goes back to biology, back to the beginnings of time. For every system there are always freeloaders, there are always parasites, and And this is what we wage against. It's inevitable. In my view, argument from authority is one of the most dangerous tools of tyranny. It's a red light message, and it says to people, don't question the experts. Turn off your brain, trust me. There is a consensus after all, say the gods of science. It's fundamentally anti-science and anti-free speech. We become a nation of pussycats, submissive sock puppets to bureaucrats if we accept the weak trust me excuses. And in anthropology, a witch doctor is known as a medicine man who appears to possess magical powers used to cure sickness, but also to harm people. It's a real element that fits here in our modern society, isn't there? We've on 5,000 years, and now the faith healers don't just heal people, they heal the planet. If the planet needs healing. They wear lab coats, and you may think it's based on solid science and reason. But listen to one of their leaders speaking. Phil Jones, when asked for the data for those world temperature graphs, said data storage availability in the 1980s meant we were not able to keep the multiple sources of data for some sites. We therefore do not hold the original raw data. These people, they've admitted that they've lost the global records, the original databases. Now, there's all kinds of innocent reasons why they might have done that. But really, this is an element of trust us, isn't it? We did all those adjustments. No one can audit them. Trust us. We have no way of checking those adjustments either. Now, I mean, sure, they've published peer-reviewed papers, but peer review just means 2 or 3 anonymous, unpaid scientists, esteemed and expert, but anonymous and unpaid, have read those papers. It doesn't mean someone checked their sums, or checked the data, or called up all their data sets, or went through it, or asked them to explain every adjustment. You think of man-made warming as a company on the stock exchange. If I told you my company was audited by 2 anonymous friends, would you buy my stock? This is what we're doing. With such low standards, we wouldn't let you trade on the ASX, but we will let you rearrange our entire global economy. This is the loophole of modern civilization, isn't it? The mother of all loopholes. And there's a shell game, we ask for evidence and they say, look, there goes a consensus. How do you measure a consensus? It's, you know, we could debate it, but what is a PhD worth versus just an honours graduate? How much does a Nobel Prize worth? Is a Nobel Prize worth 10 PhDs? Or is it 20 PhDs for a Nobel? Is a Nobel Prize in physics worth 4 times as much as a Nobel Prize in peace? Or is a Nobel Prize in peace going backwards? Negative. Are we a herd of sheep? And there it is, the graph. The evidence often offered to us by professors of science faculties who ought to know better. When they're asked for the evidence, they say 97% of climate science say blah, blah, blah. This is argument from authority. It's calling to the climate brain index. Add up the numbers of brains who say the same thing, who are all paid to study the same question. Look at a different brain index. Back a few years ago, the best financial brains in the world thought the Dow Jones was worth 14,000 points, and look what happened to them. And of course, it always comes down to the money, doesn't it? If we follow the money, she says, I've lost my notes, see, and I've forgotten one of the good lines I was going to do. Science is not a democracy, and we don't vote for the laws of physics. Can you imagine the National Academy of Science holding its AGM and calling to the crowd and saying, ladies and gentlemen, time to put your hands up this year, who's going to back gravity? Oh, it's ludicrous, isn't it? We ask for evidence, we should get evidence. Not these pat answers about consensus. 100 years ago, the best physics brains in the world said that man-made flight was impossible. And a few years later, 2 bicycle mechanics did it anyway. And 2 years after that, Scientific American was still denying that it had happened. But I need to say, the witch doctors are the fake scientists who pay homage to imaginary gods. They idolise expert opinion as if the words of certain scientists or organisations are above question. And they maintain that the results of computer simulations are more real than the results from the real world. The acolytes of the witch doctors use character assassination, bullying and bluster They recognise that much of the competition is between people. It's played out as a game of confidence. Nobody in the audience, nobody out there in the real world who's earning mortgages or paying off their mortgages and looking after the kids, none of them have time to check the details. They're waiting on the sidelines for someone to concede defeat, for someone to admit they were wrong and fall off into the corner and call it quits. So much of this is about the charade. It's not about the environment, it's about power, money and sex, and I'm going to start with the money. Money is power, and both money and power help get you sex. But the bottom line is actually, I think status is more important than all three of those. Think about status, it's a silent carrier here, because if I took away your money, your power and your sex life, if I could do that sort of thing, if you still have status, you get all three back again. With status, you can achieve money, power and a sex life for most people, I guess with help of Viagra sometimes. Well, let's follow the money. Now, we hear skeptics all the time are funded by Exxon, and it's true. Let's put the numbers on the table. The highest numbers anybody's found yet, $23 million done by the Greenpeace researchers. That's worldwide, and that's the grand total. And putting that in perspective, remember that Greenpeace struggles on with an annual international budget of around $270 million a year. And the World Wildlife Fund barely makes it with $490 million a year. These grassroots organisations have turned into the multi-million-dollar corporations that they used to fight. And the true grassroots movement is now mostly retired scientists around the world who are sitting down and saying, you know, this is way more fun than bingo. I'm going to bust Noah this week for this fault or that flaw. Give me that data, FOI for that information so that I can check the numbers. Good on them, and thank goodness. It's the largest uprising of scientific whistleblowers ever in history. 31,000 names, signed a petition, done by volunteers, done twice. 9,000 PhD names on that list. Which front page newspaper mentioned this uprising? Where did it score? 30,000 scientists sign a document twice done by volunteers, and it doesn't even make a newspaper. What do scientists have to do to get a mention, if they disagree with the mainstream establishment, to be a whistleblower? Now in 2009, over 20 years, the US government, and I documented this in a paper, looking at all the US government expenditure, starting in 1989 and going through to 2009, added up to a sum total over all those years of $79 billion. That's compared to the 23 million that was paid to skeptics over a 10-year period by Exxon. It's a 3,500 to 1 ratio. This is just the US government, it's not the other Western governments, it's not any private funding, and we know Exxon, for example, put in $100 million into one renewable energy project. There's a lot of money there spent on scientists. There is an industry. And here's the really big industry. Remember, that's $79 billion over 20 years. Carbon trading worldwide last year, just one single year, $130 billion. This is the wall of money. And the word for the carbon market is from Bart Chilton, the head of the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, that we're looking at a $2 to $10 trillion market if it gets worldwide up and running. That would make it the largest commodity market in the world, and remember this according to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission chair, $2 to $10 trillion. So the real vested interest in this, well, and I should point out, that would be a larger market than oil, coal, gas or iron. It would be the largest commodity market in the world, which is all the more amusing really because it isn't a commodity. We're just trading paper credits for imaginary atmospheric nullities over China. Things that might have happened if only someone didn't clean up that factory. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. It's not a commodity. So there's another piece of Orwellian language describing carbon trading, calling it a commodity for starters. It's not. It's a currency in paper fiat certificates. And yes, the real vested interests stand out in the open like signposted black holes hidden in plain view by a legal disclaimer. Singularities at the centre of the climate change galaxy have names like Goldman Sachs, BNP Paribas, JP Morgan, ABN AMRO, Deutsche Bank and HSBC. These are just a few of the financial houses calling for an emissions trading scheme. But notice none of them seem to be calling for a tax. Banks might want to save the environment, but not if the government gets the money. I mean, call me a cynic. The banks are just being good business players. I don't have to see any nasty intent there at all. If I was a bank shareholder, I'd think my bank was crazy if it wasn't trying to take part in a $2 trillion market that was being developed. All of those banking companies are doing the absolutely sensible thing with setting up financial trading arms in carbon trading. You'd be insane not to do it. We don't need ulterior motives on that one. It's just what companies do. So year by year, to compare the money, Big Oil spent $2 million a year on skeptics. Big Government outspent them 1,000 to 1 at least every year for those 10 years. And big banks turned over $130 billion last year. Big Barrack expected to get $645 billion when he was hoping to get his, that's over 10 years coming up though. And last year there were 2,300 lobbyists in Washington. Yes, the shadow of money on the landscape. And banks want us to trade carbon is one of those innocuous statements. That's my first 6 words to say to any of my Green friends. And I confess here that the only party I've ever been a member of is the Australian Greens. And that I still have friends who I call Greens, and there are good people amongst the Greens, and I just wish we could get some of the other side of the story out to them, because I think most of them have no idea of the other side of the equation. Yes, and subprime carbon is coming. I mean, think about the similarities. Ratings agencies have repackaged junk securities into AAA rated investments and triggered the credit crunch. The ICCC repackaged junk science made from computer simulations and created a AAA rated full gloss quasi-computer prospectus called a synthesis report. The Australian government media is buying their unaudited package hook, line and sinker. Really? The ICCC tells us it's a once-in-a-lifetime chance. It'll hardly cost anything. It'll create green jobs and it'll give us all the coastal property we could want 100 years from now. Isn't the ICCC supposed to stop that kind of thing? Big claims, wildly made in the future, vague costs. So the money market explains why Deutsche Bank take out 70-foot high advertisements near Madison Square Gardens, and why Al Gore is now the $100 million man, and he set up Generation Investment Management with his 2 new best friends who both happen to be from Goldman Sachs. The monetary web is vast. I mean, look at this, Deutsche Bank there, they've done the community good thing and put up a carbon emissions trading live counter. Where's their falling fish stocks live counter, or their erosion topsoil live counter? I mean, when are the banks, call me a cynic, when are the bankers going to worry about whales? When they can trade humpback credits. What's a 2% cut of $2 trillion? Just enough to make the banks care about the climate. I mean, the monetary web is so vast and extensive that even the BBC has an $8 billion pension fund, which is a member of something called the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. $8 billion investment fund. Now, you can't really draw too much from that, but just to point out the long links and connections here, the climate money is everywhere through the climate. There's a lot of people here just watching their bottom line, and there's also a lot of people claiming to be eco-heroes riding on a green wave. And they are riding on the crest of a green wave, it's just a different kind of green, isn't it? And again, don't mistake me, none of this tells us anything about whether CO2 causes catastrophic warming. Whether or not carbon's a problem, banks would be arguing for carbon trading. You can hardly blame them. My point is that there are massive vested interests at work here, and that once again we live in a lopsided world where Exxon gets all the headlines for the measly $23 million it put in. And where are the journalists investigating the other side of the story so that the public gets both sides of the story? And by the way, Deutsche Bank recently released a 51-page glossy climate science report. But instead of headlines of giant bankers support vast scare campaign, it's just let's shake your hand, Deutsche Bank, for being a good corporate citizen. Now, if you wanted to create a consensus hypothetically, I'm not saying this is how they did it, but it's possible. If you were, say, the Vice President of the US, you could have poured a fair bit of money, like $79 billion, into honest scientists who are doing their job. These honest scientists take all their grant applications, which are just destined to find a problem with carbon, and they do what dutiful scientists do. They produce bland, repetitive, and largely irrelevant, inconclusive papers, but it's, you know, it's honest work, and that's what you get for putting that kind of money in. Then there's a huge stack of reports, and most of them, they might be on limbs in Madagascar, but the people who write them will make sure that they reference the fact that it was due to the carbon crisis that's coming, and they haven't checked Hansen's calculations from 1984, they haven't read the models, they're Lima experts, for goodness sakes. But their paper becomes another one which honest, dutiful journalists pick up, and they count the papers. They don't actually read the details. And they count the papers. Whoa, look at those press releases, and they ignore the science. They discover a meaningless consensus of scientists doing this work. The media rubber stamps the UN committee reports without asking any hard questions at all. And look at that, we get the whole cycle, we can start again. It's an excuse for the government to say we need more money. And on it goes. And of course then, I could talk for hours about power, but I won't. In terms of power and the carbon thing, it applies differently to every different sector. I mean, for the career scientists, it's about the power to do the research that they believe in, that they're passionate about. Of course, they don't mind their rock star status, you know, call me a hero, invite me to speak on TV, and thanks for the Institute. And why would a government buy a consensus? Well, this is where the witch doctor thing comes in, because people only need a witch doctor if there are some sick witches. I mean, a sick planet. You know, create a big problem and you need a big solution. Big solutions take a lot of money and power. I mean, the UN bureaucrats soak in their fame and their junkets, and why wouldn't they? 2 weeks and 10,000 people in an exotic locale every year, Nobel Prizes for just doing their jobs. Yeah, and there's always the promise they might be at the centre of a new world financial market, dinner with Obama and tea with Nicholas Clegg. Status knocks and everyone is home. I mean, really, who would turn down that kind of power and international travel? You'd have to be insane. We're offering it. Why wouldn't they say yes? So this is so much more than just jobs. It's also about the power to usurp our own sovereign governments. The draft document for Copenhagen specifically referred to the right directly to intervene in the economies of the environments of individual countries over the heads of their elected governments. Is there any bigger power calling in the world than world government, the new world order? Ah, yes, then sex rears its ugly head. I mean, money and power is all very well to talk about bureaucrats and bankers, but what drives the journalists who kind of ignore one side of the story? I don't believe that money's got an awful lot to do with it, and I don't think power has either. What's driving the Greenpeace volunteers and the guys who paint their cars pink to save the hairy-nosed wombat? Well, there are 3 reasons. One is because a lot of them are good people and they just haven't seen the other side of the story. You know, like I said, I was a green once. You can't knock them. There are good-intentioned people in there who really do believe they're helping the planet. Well, then there's a carrot and stick thing, and the carrot is status. It becomes a proxy for you're so cool, you're intelligent. And then there's the bullying stick as well. If you speak against it, you get bullied, you get called a denier, names get thrown at you. So there are lots of processes of work. And I know you've been waiting for the part about sex. I know people have already talked about exposing a particular man's hockey stick and hiding anybody's decline, but I'm sticking strictly to biology here. Sorry. Now, evolutionary psychology and factors of sex selection, they're only going to play a small role here, but I think it's worth mentioning it's a fashion think involved in helping people feel motivated to do things. And yes, for some college students it might be about getting laid. Well, that's not driving the UN, but... Has anyone here heard of Zahavi's handicap principle? Well, it's kind of cool. If you think of peacocks, Zahavi's handicap principle is about how boys can use a handicap to win the girls. Sounds unlikely, doesn't it? But think about a peacock's tail. There's a bird wearing an extreme Gucci suit, It's glorious, but it sure ain't about survival, is it? I mean, if it helped these birds survive, the pea hens would do it too. This is not about that. These boys are showing off. They're showing they are so genetically hot they can survive even while they wear this wasteful, flapping handicap. It's advertising. So if you're a boy and you want to impress some girls, you can buy a Lamborghini. It's a supreme waste of money. It shows you've got the money to throw it away. It's advertising. Well, what does a poor guy do? How does he compete? Well, one of the possibilities is to change the playing field. Instead of being financially superior, you could be morally superior. And you can trump the man's Lamborghini by undermining it, saying, well, he's a rapacious planet destroying, spewing poisonous gases which drown babies in Chad, and make yourself morally upstanding. Yeah, I mean, he's effectively saying the Lambo's so worthless, even if I had the money, I wouldn't buy it. It's a pretty good tactic when you think about it. I mean, becoming green has become a cheap proxy for being intelligent. I didn't say it was a good proxy. The best thing you can do to pass this IQ test is you don't even need to think for yourself. In fact, thinking for yourself is a handicap that doesn't seem to work in Zahavi's principle, but anyway. So some people wear their Levi's, there's a fashion item, and some people wear their compassion. And these are motivations, they're unknowable, they could apply to people on either side of this debate. How can you tell, how can you spot the fake compassionate carers? And they're the ones claiming that they're tolerant, and at the same time they're making spiteful attacks to anyone who has a different viewpoint. They're the ones attacking old folks and pretending to care about the people. Which brings me to the bullying and the name calling. Oh, and I forgot to do the how big is my handicap. There's the peacock with its grand tail, which surely isn't about survival. There's the Lamborghini, and there's the pink car. I wasn't making it up. The bullying campaign works against the scientists, the politicians and the journalists. It prevents people from speaking their minds or even asking the right questions. Before we can begin to discuss the science, we need to stop the bullies and stop the name calling. Across society, we need to raise standards of logic and reason in my dreams. And especially at universities, in the media and schools, we need to improve it in journalistic practice. The good news is that while some commentators attack with baseless smears and unsubstantiated speculation, they do have a weak point. They do think that they're investigative journalists. They do have pride in what they do. And those shameless attacks, those people can indeed be shamed. Climate science is the first postmodern science to be corrupted en masse. It's the only science with paid attack dog sites to personally vilify any scientist who asks for evidence. These ad hominem sites pay bloggers to vilify every mistake on any topic the scientists may have made. They track down their funding sources, and if they can't find any, they smear with innuendo, just guess, speculate. And they'll attack their religious beliefs, their relatives. They can libelously imply they're paid hacks. They can make sure they mention big oil and big tobacco, even if it's 20 years old, doesn't matter. Just leaves the smuck, the smell, the smear, and thousands of unemployed 10 greens can go out and cut and paste and copy it on blogs around the world. These attack dog sites have names like DSmog and Exxon Secrets and SourceWatch. DSmog is a wing of a prominent Canadian PR firm, Jim Hogan and Associates. Jim Hogan has a big account with the David Suzuki Foundation, so his employees organised publicity for the David Suzuki Foundation, a prominent environmental scientist, one day, and they vilify scientists the next online, and they think they help the planet. The silent bystanders who tacitly support these attacks deserve to be exposed. The David Suzukis who employ agencies to help him PR himself, he's tacitly endorsing these kind of smear campaigns that DSmog runs. Scientists should be distancing themselves from those kind of ad hominem attacks. Who's calling David Suzuki to order on this? And then there's Greenpeace, who said, if you're one of those who spent your lives undermining progressive climate legislation, bankrolling junk science, fueling spurious debates around false solutions and cattle prodding democratically elected governments into submission, then hear this. We know who you are, we know where you live, and we know where you work, and we may be many, but you be few. And a commentator replied, yes, as noted, green violence. what other interpretation of it? Greenpeace did take down that page after a week, after thousands of comments were posted and blogs all over the world protesting at this obvious threat. I mean, why do they need to know where we live? If they want to send us a scientific argument, they can email it. Our addresses are up there. They don't have to turn up at our front door. I mean, really, getting back to the denier thing, there's no higher insult almost to call a scientist than calling them a denier. I mean, it's come from Nature, the esteemed publication. Well, not so esteemed anymore. It's come from the National Academy of Science. Even prime ministers are tossing it out. It's like there's a subspecies of Homo sapiens denialist. Scientific institutions. I mean, how could anyone have a conversation with a real denier? So the idea that someone is a denier automatically forecloses any real conversation, doesn't it? And while people are still calling us deniers, we have to fight the bullying and the name-calling because we can't even start discussing the evidence. I mean, you know, why would you talk with a denier? It's like explaining string theory to a dog. So, every time we hear it, those of us who object to name-calling in science must stop the bullying and just ask people to explain why people are deniers. Where's that scientific paper? Name and explain that scientific paper, which I'm denying. Let's discuss it. At least you can talk the evidence then. And let's review the bidding war regarding violence and hatred. There was Clive Hamilton who wrote to our children to turn them against us. Poor Hank Turkeys and Pat Michael and Will Happer who all lost their jobs. Heidi Cullen of the Weather Channel called for sceptical forecasters to be decertified. Yves de Boer of the UN called climate scepticism criminally irresponsible. Bernie Sanders compared climate skeptics to Nazi appeasers. James Hansen of NASA wanted trials for climate skeptics, accusing them of high crimes against humanity. Robert Kennedy Jr. called skeptics traitors. I mean, is there any accusation pretty much left there? David Suzuki called for politicians who ignore climate science, whatever climate science is, to be jailed. D. Smog's James Hogging wants skeptics treated as war criminals. Grist called for Nuremberg trials for skeptics. Hey, this is not, you know, small language there. This is highly unscientific. And then, of course, there's the Joe Romm, who encourages the idea that skeptics might get strangled in their beds, and a blogger at TPM who pondered that maybe it would be acceptable one day to execute climate deniers. Another comment that was later removed. I mean, the team who supposedly fight for the poor are the ones who almost have an approved bullying program. They give rewards to the biggest bullies. Do you know that 1 in 30 workers are estimated to be a serial bully? Kind of begs the question then, some of these people are searching for an outlet after work hours. What better way to make use of that talent than to bully for the planet? We'll believe that it's not happening when we hear the ICCC or we hear the scientists like James Hansen and others stand up and say, people, this will not do. We should stop calling them names, we should start talking evidence. Where are these scientists who claim to be scientists? Where are they talking? They may not say some of these bullying things, although James Hansen has, but where are they saying to all their supporters, you know, hang on, tone it down, guys. They're tacitly supporting it by allowing it to happen. So the Green Team quietly legitimises the bullying. It's okay to denigrate, scorn or threaten the people if you're helping the planet. I mean, and the UN has even given D. Smog a press pass. They have an official UN press pass to attend events, and New Scientist has also allowed one of the men from D. Smog to have column space. They haven't given column space to the Steve McIntyres who are leading this revolutionary whistleblower movement of scientists. They haven't given space to Anthony Watts to write his side of the story, but they found space for people like Clive Hamilton, who's not a scientist, to write his thing. I mean, I've got nothing against the other side speaking their part. Where is the equal chance for the scientists who are leading this to get a chance to speak to? Okay, so the reason the journalists don't welcome the skeptics, I think, has a lot to do with this bullying and status thing, this impressing people at dinner parties. And yeah, I've already talked about the bullying. This is D. Smog's site. There's one of their attacks on Fred Singer, a man who's been attacked for 20 years now at least, who was one of the most eminent physicists up in high-level organisations in the US government for years before he started speaking out on this, and he's been denigrated ever since. Fred Singer, this is Roger Revelle. Fred Singer wrote about Roger Revelle in an article in I think it was 1990, where he and Roger Revelle jointly wrote an article saying Roger Revelle no longer thought that we should be as worried about carbon. But now Al Gore holds Roger Revelle up as his hero that he trained with. So Al Gore's staffers highly leveraged onto Fred Singer. They urged him to take Revelle's name off the paper. They rang Nightline, I think 60 Minutes, a couple of media agencies starting to smear Singer. Well, Singer took them to court. He actually summoned Al Gore's staffers, he took them to court and he won. It cost him thousands. They made a formal apology. He may have won the battle, but who won that war? Al Gore did and his staffers, because what was the message to scientists around the world? Speak out against climate change and our attack dogs are coming, and when they do, it'll cost you thousands to defend your name against the man at the time who was the Vice President of the United States. Well, the scientists got the message, didn't they? And you can call me a conspiracy theorist, but I don't think we need to find a conspiracy amongst you. This is just a joint interest. Lots of people who want the same ends all coming together. There's, policy-wise, our incentives are screwed. Whether you're a bureaucrat or a scientist, would you work just as hard to show that your department or specialty was less important, less necessary, and less deserving of funding? It's the fatal trap of socialist management. The incentives are wrong. We asked scientists to find a crisis, so they found one. We asked bankers if they wanted extra profits. They said, okay. We asked politicians if they wanted more influence, more funding and more power to transfer money around amongst people. They said, gee, that's bad news, thanks, can we have more? And then they funded a UN agency, they started up ministries around the world, and they paid for PR campaigns just in case. We asked a UN agency to assess the risks, and then we seemed shocked when they said, the risks are massive, please give us more money, more status, more control. What did we expect they were going to do? Oh, could you imagine the guys at the UN, at the ICCC, standing up saying, hello everyone, hands up, who doesn't think carbon is going to cause us a big problem and we all need new jobs? Anyone? And I think we also should be worried about the rise of the fake free markets. The idea that this carbon market is a free market when it's based on a commodity which isn't a commodity, and when no one would spend a cent to buy a carbon credit if it wasn't done through government force by mandate. It's not a free market, and yet it keeps being called the free market solution. There's some false advertising going on here. And I think also there's the illusion out there that the media provides us with a free market. In some senses that's true, but where's the media reporting both sides of the story? It's nothing like the internet, which really is a free market. And we kind of thought scientific institutes would compete amongst themselves, but almost all their funding comes from the government, and almost all those grants, $79 billion, remember, are coming with the words, dealing with climate change, mitigating climate change, adapting to climate change, and trips to the UN every year for 2 weeks to join their junkets. To give you some idea of how big those junkets were, when we went to Bali, there were, a big conference runs for 3 days and might have 1,000 people. The Bali one was much smaller than Copenhagen. There were 12,000 people there and it lasted for 2 weeks. This is junkets on a grand scale. That's almost as big as the Olympics. They do that every year, although I believe this year's looking a little smaller. A lot smaller than it was before. Okay, so in a nutshell, and nut being the word of the day, we can summarise things up and say the bullies accuse us of bullying, and those on the team who earn billions accuse us of taking money, and those who repeat illogical error after error tell us we can't think, and those who don't know what evidence is think we don't have any, and those who deny the obvious call us deniers. It's an upside down world, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? Thank you for coming today. It's a delight to be here. Thank you. I forgot one last slide. Humour me, Jim. I think, we used satire, parody and shame when we got no money to help explain the situation. I probably haven't got time to go through one of my favourite graphs, but that was the US postal charges drive global warming satirical graph. I can explain 72% of the correlation with global warming, and it's thanks to the postage stamp price rises. If you've got satirical ideas, send them in to me. I think they're very valuable. Oh, new scientist. Yes, becomes non-scientist. Why scientific fraud's okay? Climate change is our favourite religion. We defend corrupt scientists and attack unpaid volunteers. The National Academy of Science, which looks like this, can be satirised as the National Academy of Sorcery. Or once great institutions become a tool of witchcraft. Who needs weather balloons? We can forecast the climate with Google citations. See the blacklist for his skeptic voodoo doll inside. A trial without a defence is a sham. Business without competition is a monopoly. Science without a debate is propaganda. Ladies and gentlemen, we need the emergency logic squad. It's got to go to Parliament, it's got to go to schools. We need to teach people how to reason. Thank you.